All right, good morning, y'all. My name is Ryan Thompson. I'm a senior here in our political science department, and today I'm presenting my bachelor's essay titled Backwards Balloting, Anti-Self-Interest Voting in the South. So when it comes to thinking of your typical Southerner, what images typically come to mind for y'all? You might think of someone who is uneducated, who comes across as a redneck. You might think about different types of food or other things when it comes to identifying the South or the people that are there. So the long Southern strategy made Southern white political behavior seem strange or irrational, even though it is not. The Long Southern Strategy is a book by Maxwell and Shields that details the Republican strategy from the 50s and 60s to now that has resulted in the current voting patterns that we see in the South. And so the previous research on self-interest and voting in the South and just in general combining those two, so to start with self-interest, it was mostly started in the 19th century towards economic theory for why people should have government and for how it relates. And then in more modern senses, it has shown that people don't often consider self-interest when it goes into voting, especially because voting is a more larger scale thing. So self-interest is very niche and doesn't typically have large-scale effects on national size voting. Going back to the Republican strategy from the long Southern strategy that I referenced, that has been crucial to solidifying the Republican dominance in the South through courting white voters, specifically those that have pre-existing racial conservatist bias. Southern identity has been found to be shared amongst those that are in the South. A lot of previous research by Dr. Knotts and his colleague Chris Cooper have found that the Southern identity exists within the peripheral South, and then what people understand about the South is distinct here versus those who are also out of the South, and the characteristics related in voting patterns and other behaviors are truly distinctive here versus for those who live elsewhere in the country. And then ultimately, emotions and prejudices can be passed down through generation to generation, and that is where my research focuses on how different ideas, so whether that's racial animus or prejudice or any other type of identity, can also be passed down from parents to children. We know that parents are who their kids get most of their socialization from for policy and for how they view the world. And so my research is looking at how the South is changing and how for each generation to the next, we're starting to see different identities of what it means to be Southern and how that relates to their self-interest voting. So I wanted to do another quote from Maxwell and Shields. They basically summarized everything really well for my argument in their book. So this quote kind of gets to the crux of the issue here, is that even now, minority advancement is tantamount to white persecution. And so basically, what they mean by this is that white people in the South, even if they are poor or have other class-related issues, would rather keep a social status of being higher than their perceived other instead of voting for class-conscious building policies that would benefit all poor people. Instead, they would want to vote for a policy that benefits white people instead of everyone total. And so for the key findings from the research, Dr. Knotts and I were able to make, we're able to make an empathetic action scale that ranked people on a scale of 4 to 20, between 4 being the highest empathetic with 20 being the lowest. And so from there, I did different variables like poverty, their opinion on welfare policies, and other things like that to see from the South and out of the South how it differed and if these people were voting with more empathy in mind or on a more selfish, what they were more about them. And so what the research showed here was that every subsequent generation since the silent generation has slightly, not significantly, but slightly started voting by their average more empathetically than the previous. So this is showing that the South and the country as a whole is changing as each generation comes along. It also showed that people who indicated differences that were hurting their familial relationships had a much higher empathetic voting than people who said that politics didn't affect family relationships. So that would support that those people probably are voting more against their self-interest or their perceived self-interest because they were more empathetic to others, because the empathy scale focused on how often those voters considered other people whenever they made their actions or when they went to vote. So I would say that if you considered others more often than not, you're probably not necessarily voting just for your self-interest, but for how you see the self-interest of society as a whole. And so for those people that indicated having a bad family relationship because of it, I would say that's because they are voting against what the people around them in their social groups are used to them voting. People who scored higher on indicators of modern racism were also less empathetic than those who did not score as high. And so some of those indicators were policies like welfare, government aid, and then using different feeling thermometers between white people and black people to see what the differences were, and then comparing that in the South and out of the South. And then lastly, what I found really interesting was that poverty status, so like how they were, well, obviously if they're above poverty or below poverty, so basically their current economic status was not a strong indicator of how someone would vote. So that basically just shows that people are a lot more emotional voters rather than being a rational voter. And so some conclusions from that are obviously that Southern voting patterns may seem irrational outside of the South, but for those who grow up here or share a Southern identity, it makes sense when you understand the history of the South and especially the strategy from the Republican Party from the 50s, 60s to now. Sorry, hard to read from here. Overall, for future research, it's hard to truly quantify what self-interest is. It's a very transitive thing. It can change from one person to the next, and it also can change on the location you're in. So for this, I focused mostly on what how you think someone ought to be voting, so a very normalized or normative statement of what their current status was and what would be most beneficial to that short-term impact of their life. For future research, I think comparing this with the availability of voting would be interesting to see how, if polling places are closer to you, does that influence someone's interest in voting? Because voting itself isn't necessarily rational when you think of the cost associated to actually go vote, wait in line, versus what you gain as a voter. And then so lastly, I want to go back to that stereotype you probably thought of the Southerner and say that it's time that, not again, I don't like the clicker, and say it's time to start changing how we view the South and the people that are there. When you think of your traditional Southerner, like I said, you probably think of someone who's working class, white, poor, or uneducated. But interestingly enough now, in the South, black people and white people alike are just as likely to identify as Southern. So that's showing that our area is changing. And overall, like this paper for me was about trying to change the narrative behind the people in the South and how we vote. I'm a lifelong Southerner. I may not fit that normal Southern stereotype, but my Southern identity matters just as much as the stereotypical one. And it's time we change the conversation because the South isn't full of people who aren't voting in their interest. It's full of people who are trying to vote to help their situation now. Thank you.